Mwahaha. Yes, I know the scary thing here is not just the election or what you may be finding in your kids' plastic pumpkins tonight, but also the technical difficulties we sometimes encounter when we try to play eerie music. So anyway, sorry for the late start, folks, but I think that you'll find it worth it. If you're not familiar with this party, my name is Jay Frost, and I'm the host of the Philanthropy Mastermind series. Today is a little bit different. I don't know if you've been through this with us before, but I'm going to share some of the stories that I've heard over the years. Some are quite old, but still very relevant. Others are really new and frightening that we don't know them. And still others are ones I hope to hear from you. So this is a small, safe space. You can post in the chat. You can also post in the Q&A, and there you can do it anonymously. And I would love to have you do both, because that's the way that we will know not only that you're paying attention, but much more importantly, you can share what you have learned. And I just saw somebody raise their hand. You don't need to raise your hand. You can just go ahead and post in the chat or in the Q&A. But later, if anybody would like to appear live on screen and reveal those scary stories from your offices or past work, well, maybe I'll let you in that way too, but I'll go ahead and I'll prompt you, and then you can let me know in the chat. So another thing I should mention is that we don't typically within the series talk about DonorSearch, our sponsor, but that isn't because we don't love them. We certainly do. If it were not for DonorSearch, we couldn't be doing all these fun things that we've been doing going back to 2016. So if you're interested in past episodes, not just of Halloween stuff, but all the things we do, you can find our webcasts, webinars for credit, and podcasts are all available for you over the DonorSearch site at donorsearch.net under the resources tab, as well as on our YouTube channel where this recording will be. But stick around because you should participate in this one. And in addition, you can also learn all about your donors, of course, through DonorSearch. So if you don't know what they are or what they're about, I hope you'll check that out right there as well. But maybe I'll revisit that later in the course of the presentation today. I want to say hello to, of course, Reed, who let us know that we were getting a late start, and you were right. But also Jennifer and Forrest, Megan and Elizabeth, for all saying hello. We really do appreciate that. And it's nice to see somebody in Northern Virginia, which is where I am doing this podcast from. So thank you very much for hanging out with us today. And San Francisco, wow, it's early for you. So we have, of course, a lot of stories, but once again, this is kind of a bit of a free-for-all. So I'm going to share some of what I've learned, some of the things that are fun, some not so fun, some a little bit funny, but I really also want to lean into what you know, what you've heard. So if there's something you want to share, you can start saying that either what you're willing to share, or you can post something in the Q&A, which we can see, and then I can either just read it without telling anyone your name, or I can welcome you up to the stage. But we're going to start actually with a question, which is whether or not you recognize any of the following names. Father Bruce Ritter. Anybody know that name? I'm not seeing anything yet. So maybe I'm stumping you. How about Will Aramoni? I know Reed will recognize that name. Or John Bennett Jr. How about Lorraine Hale? Roger Chapin? Larry Jones? John Donald Cody? I'm going to tell you a little bit about these people to start, because there's a kernel of wisdom in learning from our past. And some of it's not so long ago. Some of these stories are from Charity Watch. Others are from other sources. I'll try to cite all of them that are not anonymous as we go through the conversation today. I'm going to start with Father Bruce Ritter. He was associated with something called Covenant House. And by the way, this is not to cast any aspersions on any organizations here. Some of you may be affiliated with or support these organizations. This is talking about largely isolated incidents from which we can learn. So the reason we start with these people is because some of these examples are so horrible and egregious that what actually shocks me is not that they happened, that was bad, but that we've forgotten that they happened. And we've forgotten these names. And actually some of this information is, of course, lessons that we can learn from today. In Father Bruce Ritter's case, he was, again, the founder of Covenant House and celebrated for supporting homeless youth. but his reputation was completely destroyed by allegations of sexual misconduct and financial misappropriation. He reportedly used Covenant House funds to support personal relationships with residents, and an internal investigation found at least 15 instances of misconduct, exposing how unchecked power led to exploitation within that, at that point, very well established and lauded charity. Another one is William Aramone. And so for the people in the DC area, you may remember this name, but really was a national story. He was once a revered figure in the nonprofit world and the CEO of United Way of America. Nobody seems to know that, but that's okay. He misused, I think that's a good, safe diplomatic word to use, $1.2 million in charity funds to sustain a lavish lifestyle, which included a relationship with a teenage girl. His 1995 conviction for fraud and conspiracy really damaged United Way's reputation at that time, illustrating the dangers, in this case, not just of the behavior, but poor financial oversight. Since if there was a little closer look at the books, in this case, they probably would have identified all that money flowing out, as well as where it was going much earlier. Another one that's a little more obscure, but the story is really relevant, is the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy, John Bennett Jr. He was the creator of the foundation, which turned out to be a $135 million Ponzi scheme. He used the new donations to pay previous participants, diverting millions of charity dollars into fraudulent schemes. And the scandal really does underscore the critical need for regulatory scrutiny in the nonprofit sector, something we discuss almost every year. But sometimes it's hard to get both parties, let alone our entire sector, in agreement about what's the right kind of oversight, what kinds of laws are not causing too much encumbrance on our ability to do good. But when we don't have the oversight, well, things like that can happen. Lorraine Hale, you may recognize the name Hale because of Hale House. And Hale House was something she inherited from her mother, Lorraine Hale did, and her husband, she and her husband took over $700,000 in charity funds for personal luxuries, such as art and home upgrades. And as a result, of course, it sullied the reputation of an organization previously renowned for helping impoverished children, emphasizing the risk of, in this case, familial control without accountability. So in other words, those small boards, essentially closely held, where the person says it's my organization. This is a phrase I've heard as a consultant many times when I try to caution people that it's wonderful that people are fully invested in the growth and success of an organization. They feel that sense of ownership, but that in fact it is not owned by that individual or that group of people or a family, but it's owned by all of us. It's a public good, which is why it's a 501c3. So sometimes more accountability at the board level can be helpful. Here's another one that has fallen into obscurity, which is Roger Chapin. Calling himself a, quote, nonprofit entrepreneur, Roger Chapin ran charities that directed just 25% of donations to veteran services, using the rest to benefit friends and for personal gain. Between 2004 and 2006, which I recognize now is 20 and 18 years ago, Congress investigated Chapin, discovering millions paid to associates under somewhat questionable circumstances. And this case highlights the ethical dangers of nonprofits with boards that fail to, once again, enforce financial discipline. And of course, boards have a fiduciary and legal responsibility. It's important for board members to be protected, but it's also important for board members to do their job, even if they have that protection of insurance on the board. Another name that may be vaguely familiar is Larry Jones. Anybody recognize that name? Larry Jones was the founder of Feed the Children. Feed the Children, and Larry Jones specifically, faced numerous accusations of financial misconduct, including awarding no-bid contracts to companies linked to his son. Allegations of kickbacks and unauthorized spending led to his dismissal, showing how long-standing leaders with unchecked authority and often familial ties can misuse nonprofit funds. I promise I'm not going to go through all of these because I actually have, if I'm just talking about these bad actors, a list of 15 which are just at the top of the pyramid in terms of some of these misdeeds. One thing I should mention, though, is that even if I were to go through all of them, and I'll just list some of the names just for fun, they include Central Asia Institute, Greg Mortensen, famous for his book, of course, the Wingo family, Angel Food Ministries, Somali Mom, the Somali Mom Foundation, James Reynolds and family, the Cancer Fund of America and affiliates, V. Shore, National Children's Leukemia Foundation, Kim Williams Healing Arts Initiative, Brian Mullaney, Wonderwork, Lola Jean Amarin of the Ark in Hawaii. What's interesting to me is what's not here. There's a big story for the last few years that I'm afraid is going to be like this, one of those apocryphal stories that gets lost to history. If you were to list something that's not in this list, that worst egregious example of the donor from hell, the truly terrifying example, who would that be for you? I'm going to look for it right here in the chat. So go ahead and list whatever name strikes you as missing that we really should have been paying attention to in the last few years. I'm sure everyone's thinking about it, especially in the political environment days. So I'm going to wait for just a moment while you give that some thought. I'm also interested to know, as we have this discussion, whether or not you encountered circumstances not maybe quite as dire as these, but ethical questions which have come up, which is the framework for the rest of the conversation today. And I really do want it to be a conversation. So what I'm going to do is frame some of this in a moment around two things. The ethical principles embodied at AFP, this is their ethics month after all, and also within APRA. And the reason why APRA is because APRA a long time ago established ethical principles for dealing with data. And data now, of course, underlies everything we all do in every single way. Not only whether or not we're a healthcare institution and trying to make sure that we really understand and apply HIPAA principles properly, but also in environments like university settings and that information and the privacy of that information, and all the way to, of course, our application of new current generation and next generation AI tools, such as generative AI, and how we utilize that information, what we put into it, what we take out, and that issue of trust. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these things in the context of the way AFP looks at them, and also the way APRA looks at them, in the hope that that guides us into some of the stories and makes some of them a little more fun and others more prescient. I do see just one example here from North. Thank you, North, saying Feeding America. Yes, that's certainly one, but it's not the one I was thinking about. I'm thinking about an individual in this case. So I don't see any other takers. So let me ask that question differently. If you were putting together your America's Most Wanted list of the worst past actors in the nonprofit sector, the people who just were completely beyond the pale, you wouldn't want to touch them. Okay, so this is non-controversial here. And deceased, who would be on your list? I feel like playing password music because there's somebody who is given to a number of institutions connected to many of us, and they kept working with them a lot longer probably than they should have. I'm going to let you chew on that for a minute. Now, one of the things that I like to think about when I think about this stuff, of course, is the individuals. But it's not just these people, these donors, and organizational founders that are always the issue. Sometimes it's the organizations themselves, how we do business. You saw that alluded to in some of those examples where you have a founder and it's really the board could have provided more oversight. There are a lot of those examples, and I'm going to give you a few in a moment. But first, I want to acknowledge the people in the chat. So Sarah and Megan, thank you. I was not thinking Bernie Madoff, but certainly he could be on the list, and that's a lot like New Era philanthropy. That was a Ponzi scheme, so was Madoff's work. So it's a great example. But and William Aramoni, certainly, who we talked about briefly earlier, huge example of this. The one I was personally thinking about was the one that Sarah mentioned, and that's Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I don't have the whole Epstein story in front of me, but what I will say is if you're not familiar with the story of Jeffrey Epstein and how he managed to ingratiate himself to organizations, I think it's a really important tale for all of us. Not only in terms of the evils that he did. He was notorious for sexual, what is the right term for it? This gross example of what is commonly now referred to as grooming young women, or very, very young women, girls, and then forcing them to essentially a form of sexual slavery. And this went on for years. He eventually was arrested, was convicted for some of those crimes, and then eventually, he was imprisoned, and then died in prison under somewhat questionable circumstances, but ruled a suicide. But in the middle of all this, there were several institutions, including MIT and Harvard, for example, which had some level of engagement with him somewhere along that path. And I'm not saying after he was in jail, but the reason I'm mentioning this is because they both had policies in place, very good ones, I might add, in order to protect themselves, the reputation of the school, their staff, their students, the community, from bad actors. But in both cases, the policies were not necessarily applied in a uniform, consistent, and effective manner. And so as a result, especially in the MIT example, if you go back and look through that, there was within a department within MIT that kept kind of working with him, and then he was spending a great deal of time there, and they did receive funds from him. Now, what both institutions did afterwards, after the conviction, was quite different. One returning all the money, another one, I believe, dedicating that to survivors of sexual abuse. But it's the idea that it was still either possible or acceptable within even a department of a major university to continue to engage with a person under these questionable circumstances, which I think we can learn from. So it's not to in any way cast aspersions against two extraordinary institutions, but to say if they can have this kind of fault line, which didn't necessarily impact any female students in these places, I don't know that happened, but rather just to potentially increase the risk and to work with a person to maybe potentially greenwash their contributions. I think what's important for the rest of us is to do two things. And one is to establish a set of policies that we apply to make sure, of course, that everybody knows what those policies are, and then to uniformly practice them. We can always make adjustments when we learn from our errors, but to err on the side of protecting our institutional reputations and the people we love and support our work, that has to be one of the most important jobs. So anyway, thank you for throwing some names in the mix. So as I said, there are a lot of people out there, and sometimes it's easy to put up a poster in the post office. Is there one anymore? I'm aging myself. There used to be like help wanted posters in a post. I haven't been to the post office in years, but there used to be posters which would show you this bad person. And if we had the equivalent of that online, of course, here are the most notorious actors, you would find it in places like the source I just mentioned, which is the Charity Watch Hall of Shame. They have one that's from 2018 and other sources. But the organizations too fall into this, meaning that it's not just one person or a couple of people, but it's organizational culture that becomes the issue. So I'm going to give you a few of those, and then we're going to dive into the AFP Apple world and some personal stories. So if you've got one, save it up. First, the Sugar Research Foundation. This goes way back in history, 1960s. So why even talk about this? Well, because actually it's kind of relevant for those who are seeking, let's say, corporate support. Back in the 60s, the Sugar Research Foundation paid scientists to downplay the risks of sugar and instead point the blame at fat. If you look at American health between the 1960s and today, including figures on obesity and heart disease, et cetera, you can see why this is still relevant. And sometimes having a longitudinal look, looking at things historically, how they fit into contemporary society is actually pretty important. This unethical influence on research shifted dietary guidelines for decades. So for those of us who grew up with a food pyramid that showed, certain things you were supposed to eat and how much of them, well, those things were influenced by this research, misleading the public about what we were eating. It's a clear reminder that the influence that funders can have on science and the importance of integrity in research. We're having a discussion today, of course, with respect to energy companies. And I'm talking about a wide variety of energy companies and how they have potentially influenced our views about climate change. So my point here is not a political one. It's really about our own policies, setting policies which work for us, and making sure that that we aren't caught in this kind of weird position later because we let things slip, especially because we just thought we needed the money. Well, sometimes that money can lead to a difference in orientation. Now, there's also Red Cross Haiti relief in 2010. It's getting a little closer to our current times. You may recall, depending on how old you are, that there was a huge earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And the Red Cross raised nearly $500 million with large promises for housing projects. Later investigations, however, revealed that only 6 permanent homes had been built. And that sparked, of course, a great deal of criticism over mismanagement. And that case is a powerful example of why accountability is crucial in disaster relief, where urgent needs mean high stakes for transparency. And if I'm happy to provide sources for any of this, but it's a very interesting story. And it shows that even really wonderful organizations can sometimes slip on 2 fronts, both in terms of application of funds. Maybe it's because they were trying to raise funds as quickly as they could. Maybe they just received the funds and then they had to figure out how to apply them. And perhaps there was not a complete plan in place about how to do so. Perhaps it was difficult to apply those funds, but in any case, they clearly didn't communicate it well to the community, which is why they took such a hit in terms of their public reputation for quite some time. The Sierra Club and natural gas funding, also 2010. Sierra Club, of course, is known for environmental advocacy, and they accepted over $26 million from natural gas companies between 2007 and 2010. Again, it seems like ancient history, but it affects a lot about our discussion today on climate change. When the environmental toll of fracking became clear, the Sierra Club cut ties with the funders and tightened their funding, their donation policies. And that incident does demonstrate how critical it can be to ensure funding sources align with organizational values, which is why, of course, I'm mentioning this right now. So we have a comment from Jamie, and again, I want to make this conversational, so I'm going to take the liberty of just sharing this, Jamie. So are institutions themselves meant to be the accountable regulatory body for publishing misleading information? I won't presume to have the answer to this. I'm certainly no oracle, but I think that this is the right question, is how much responsibility do we carry? What can we do to protect ourselves and our community? And I think that in the case of course, Sierra Club, for example, I wasn't there working with the team, but I imagine that when they did look at all this and then make their decisions to tighten their donation policies, it was a reflection of what they had learned. So my question is, what can we learn and then apply in advance so we can avoid some of that problem? An example I gave last year when we had this discussion, and it's in the short video that we used to promote this session, is about the World Health Organization, which I had a chance to work on a small project there a number of years ago. And the thing that really struck me immediately about doing some kind of a development assessment and suggestions was that the World Health Organization, at least at that time, was extraordinarily clear about what kinds of monies they could accept. Now, what did it mean to individuals? I can't speak to that, but in terms of organizations, corporate support, they were very clear. And one example, of course, is tobacco companies. So for most of us, that seems like a no-brainer, right? I mean, whether we like tobacco and tobacco companies or not, we could probably make the immediate link that the World Health Organization probably doesn't want funding from tobacco companies, and that is absolutely correct. I don't believe they take funding from, also from one of the other major categories, alcohol, beverage companies, and I believe there's another major category. But they established that in order to prevent any misunderstanding, and also to be able to communicate that clearly to the public, so people wouldn't say that they were being hypocritical. So I love this question, Jamie. I'm sorry I'm not giving you a definitive answer. I'm really happy that you're asking it. And the second part of what you said is also important. Or do external bodies have less weight when critiquing things that have conflict of interest? It's another really important question, especially when it comes to weight. So here's various ways we might think about this, sort of like these other organizations had to do. One is, if we receive a donation and no one learns about it, is it like a tree that falls in the forest? Did it make any sound? The only problem is that someday someone's going to take a walk on that trail and find that tree. And in our case, it means that someday someone's going to walk by and say, were you really taking money for fracking? Now, the next question is, how much weight does that one, two, three individuals, or maybe members of the board, groups within the community, potential funding source from a foundation, other corporate sponsors, how much weight do they have? It's hard to say and almost impossible to predict. So I guess what I'm advocating is, if we can establish policies which are aligned with our values early, and then be open to making adjustments with them as we learn and evolve, then we're in a much better position to deal with the questions about it later. Greatest example of this of all, to my mind, is the opioid crisis, where the Sackler family, of course, and by the way, there are a lot of members of that family, and they were not all involved in the business, were not to the same degree, certainly. But those who were directly involved with the pharma and the creation and distribution and promotion of opioids could arguably be held accountable, and they were in the courts for responsibility for the opioid crisis, for all those deaths. Again, that's not to say that everyone with the name Sackler, like everyone with the name Frost or any of your names, is responsible. But it is to say that those behind that crisis did bear some responsibility legally and ultimately philanthropically, as that settlement maintained. And so one of the questions might be, well, if you were taking money from an entity at some point, which many did from the Sackler family, is that the kind of money you want? Before we knew that how many people had died from opioids, are we well aligned with a pharmaceutical company? Are we well aligned with a pharmaceutical company that produces certain kinds of drugs, pain reduction? From one standpoint, that's a very beneficial thing. From another one, it's not aligned with their values. Let's think about it now. Let's think about it first. It's really the world's longest answer to the best question. So thank you for that, and keep those coming. I'm going to give you just a couple more and then give you some stories that are kind of crazy and fun. National Football League's tax status. Until 2015, the NFL, probably many of you know this, had nonprofit status, despite the fact that they have huge revenues and multi-million-dollar executive salary. And after public pressure, the NFL relinquished that status, prompting conversations about what qualifies as a nonprofit and the ethical implications of tax exemptions for high revenue organizations. Planned Parenthood profit allegations. In 2015, they were secretly filmed, or some Planned Parenthoods were, and leading to accusations that Planned Parenthood was profiting from fetal tissue donations. This isn't getting into the politics about whether or not Planned Parenthood is a fine organization and provides services that are essential or not, but rather just to talk about how those videos, taken for very particular political purposes, were then a device that launched into another conversation about whether or not an organization should be generating revenue in certain ways, which is the main reason I'm mentioning it. Boy Scouts of America, a huge abuse lawsuit. Wounded Warrior Project in 2016, another controversial thing because they raised a tremendous amount of money to benefit, of course, veterans, wounded veterans particularly, but there were significant sums that were paid for high-profile events, which were quite lavish. And the question then becomes, is that appropriate or not? And one of the issues there is not whether or not I think they're appropriate, or even maybe you do, but did they discuss it in advance? Did they figure out how to characterize that before the public? Were they prepared for any kind of backlash? And so once again, policies, procedures, and crisis communications, I think all are important things to consider. I'm not going to go through the rest. I'll just highlight them. The Clinton Foundation in 2016, the Trump Foundation in 2016, very strange, occurring in roughly the same time frame. the More Charitable Foundation fraud, the Leo DiCaprio Foundation, which I had totally forgotten about in 2016. This was an embezzlement scandal involving a financier, and it raised questions about transparency in celebrity charities, and so forth and so on. The most recent one of these, and it just happened this year, so that's why I'm going to highlight it and then move on, is Balanced Nutrition Inc. Anybody hear about that one? Balanced Nutrition Inc. In this case, North Carolina regulators found a major compliance issue with Balanced Nutrition, a nonprofit run by the wife of Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. And the audit revealed incomplete paperwork, ineligible claims, and misuse of public funds. The scandal does highlight the importance of oversight in managing taxpayer dollars, especially when political and familial ties are involved. And the reason I'm mentioning this here is not to center on Mark Robinson. That's why I was trying, of course, to list all of these people, from the Clintons to the Trumps and everybody else. But because in this case, this was about dollars and cents. So whomever it was running it, in this case, the wife of, if there were closer oversight, then maybe this would not be an issue. And this could be material, or one of the material factors in the judgment that voters will be making in just a few days. In this case, as the title of the article says from the Associated Press, North Carolina regulators say nonprofit run by Lieutenant Governor's wife owes the state $132,000. I wouldn't want to be either the person running for office or that charity in the middle of that discussion. And it's not the only issue with that campaign and that race, but it certainly is one more that they didn't need to discuss if there was a little more oversight. So do any of these resonate for you, or do they seem so extreme that they can never happen to you? Because I can tell you, they probably do. So here are some examples of cases where organizations have encountered some really scary things. And I'm going to start with some stories that I've received from people over the years. Some are quite old, so you'll see by virtue of the kinds of technology they reference. Others are very new. And they are, the reason why most are anonymous is because they are so awful and embarrassing. And it's not because somebody did something wrong intentionally in these cases, almost never, but it's because they just didn't know any better. They didn't have a policy in place. There was no oversight. And oftentimes these seem kind of benign, but sometimes they can be a little bit scary. So Jamie, you're making another comment here, which I appreciate. If these events occur due to oversight, then what existing measures do we have to address them preemptively? Okay, if they occur due to oversight, I don't know if they, in my mind, and if I'm reading your comment correctly, I don't believe that these things occur because there's oversight, but they might occur in spite of it. So if that's what you meant, and I apologize if I'm misunderstanding you, but if that's what you meant, then I guess I would believe that the policies and procedures and mechanisms within the organization for addressing them, thank you, would allow us to what's an expression for it? Fish or cut bait? I mean, to make a decision right away. No, this already fell outside of our guidelines, and I'm sorry, but we can't do that. We run into that a lot already as fundraisers. So for the fundraisers in the call, inevitably some organizations offer money it can't accept, or some kind of gift it doesn't want. The traditional ones I remember were things like, we're going to give you a gift of property, but it's a gas station. So now you have to figure out how to dig up the oil tanks, or it's a work of art and they love it. And but it's not something that makes sense for your organization to hang on the wall. They don't really want you to sell it, so it doesn't have any material value to your mission, doesn't have any money, it's not producing any revenue. Or the craziest one I remember personally was about someone wanting to create I think it was a pond or a lake on the campus of a school, because they remembered something like that when they were young, or perhaps they thought it should have been there. I can't remember, but there was no way they were going to accept that money. So in each of these cases, they knew what they were there to do, the mission, right? They knew the kinds of gifts that would be appropriate to do that, and they would only accept those. And so if something fell outside of that, then they would just have to say, I'm sorry. Bless and release is another nice way to say it. But there are lots of gray areas, and some of those are going to be what we talk about now. So stick with me as we dive in. I'm going to read you a couple of titles. You tell me which one you want to hear. We'll start with these three. Howling Good Time, Life on the Farm, and You, Your Wife, and Your Other Wife. Okay, so again, you have to tell me which one you want to hear. This is under the category I would describe as accuracy. So in other words, making sure we got our information and our stories right, which is a very important principle within APRA's code of conduct. And I think it's one that we all learn from in this world of fundraising and nonprofits. So we have one vote so far of Life on the Farm. Anybody else? Again, Howling Good Time, Life on the Farm, or You, Your Wife, and Your Other Wife. Okay, I'm hearing Life on the Farm. Okay, I guess so far that's our winner. All right, and this is just like on Tuesday. If you don't vote, you have to get what everybody else wanted. Okay, and we have a couple for the wives, so maybe I'll do both because they're both short. Okay, so Life on the Farm. These are true stories. People have just sent them to me over the years. My boss approached me one day to tell me one of our governors had read a research report in which I wrote about a prospect's sexual activities. Dumbfounded, I said there was no way I would ever write about something like that. I immediately went to my research, it's the person in the research operation, to see what I had written. On my report, which was about a retired couple, I wrote that they enjoyed loving on their farm. I meant to type enjoyed living on their farm. And you can imagine my red face. Needless to say, I reported back to my boss. It was a lack of proofing rather than a lack of judgment. So nice, innocent mistake, and kept internal. So You, Your Wife, and Your Other Wife. Here you go. A place I used to work for was set about to deliver a named endowment proposal to a major donor. The major gifts officer gave information to the staff to prepare the document and a mock plaque. Unfortunately, neither the major gift officer nor the staff double-checked the names. They were going off the major gift officer's personal address file. This is also, among other things, an argument for having one file, one source of truth, which everyone utilizes at their appropriate level of administrative access. So unfortunately, neither the major gift officer nor the staff double-checked the names. They were going off the major gift officer's personal address file, and the information was old. The proposal had the major donor's former wife's name, and they had just ended a very messy divorce. The good news is that the proposal was delivered in person and not to the former wife's house. And the major donor calmly pointed out the error and agreed to the endowment with the name change to the current wife. And of course, then we had a gift basket. The gift basket was sent. It was given to them with all the fanfare to thank them for agreeing, and it had the former wife's name on it. Got to get our facts straight. There are lots of good examples of this stuff about accuracy. And this seems like the bane of our existence, right? And it's hard, but if we don't get things right, it really, really messes us up. There are a lot of examples from AFP, which produced an article series last year all about ethics. And several of those were stories that essentially were about this. One was about how, in one person's case, their organization is very large, has multiple programs at 30 different sites around the country. And when a program is struggling to meet revenue goals through government grants and private funding, it goes on a watch list there prior to being closed within the budget year. The ethical dilemma is whether or not to continue fundraising for the program once it's on the watch list. So this is almost back to Jamie's point, right? Now you've got a policy. In this case, the policy is this is what we're going to do fundraising for. Recently, we were awarded a grant from, this is going back to the first person. Recently, we were awarded a grant from a private foundation for a program that closed between the time of the application and when the check was received. So what do you do, to your point, Jamie, when something like this happens? How do they resolve the dilemma? what they said at the time, 2023, was, we are hoping to be able to retroactively expense the foundation award for expenses related to the closed program within the fiscal year. Very creative, actually. If we're not able to, we will return the check, which is really important. The ethics around fundraising for watch list programs is still debatable. That's particularly for new programs that are struggling to launch, end up on the list. And and they were also positing that they think this ethical dilemma stems from having too many programs and launching programs without lining up first-year funding. So, in other words, chasing the money instead of solidifying the program. Now, I'm going to go on to another one, which is relevance. So, in other words, are we doing things that really matter? Are we doing the things that we should be doing? Relevance. So, here are a couple, and you tell me which one. Blackout tails, and that doesn't look like me. Which one would you like to hear? Blackout tails, or that doesn't look like me. Okay, we've got one that doesn't look like me. Oh, and blackout tails. Wow. Okay, this is the problem with democracy. This is why we're all going to be up until like 3 a.m. on January 5th, probably. You never know. This is a joke for Americans. So if you're from outside the United States, inside the United States, you can laugh with it. Outside the United States, you can laugh at us. Anyway, this is my version of democracy in the mastermind series. So thank you for your votes. All right, so I'll start with blackout tails. I tried to do both fast. This is when people actually blacked out comments. So some of you, do you work with print? Does anybody work with print? There is a value in having printed documents. Anyway, say, don't say, whatever you think. But in this case, they were working with paper documents as well as digital. And they said, I'm still blacking out comments made and filed by a former vice president who would write notes in the margins of call reports. Well, this means, first of all, they did call reports. So thank God for that. But anyway, making notes in the margins of call reports, calling donor things, well, like this. And these are all quotes from the margins. Jane confided in me that she's having her will rewritten now to eliminate her niece and nephew. Here's another one. She explained her two sons don't get along. And the will says they cannot divide the estate equitably between them. The entire estate will be left to University X. Here's another one. Alan said Tim should not be contacted as he is not well. Charlie added he was corrupted by all the money, did not handle the stress well of playing second fiddle to his brother, and is paranoid, and they think he lives in Monaco. And then here's one. I relayed a personal story to her about my father's remarriage at the age of 82 when he was in poor health, and commented that at least she didn't have a situation like that. If that's not TMI, I don't know what is. Now here's a little bit from That Doesn't Look Like Me. This one's from this year. Duke University recently attempted to honor donors Aubrey and Kathleen McClendon by installing gargoyle sculptures in their likeness. But it didn't quite go as planned. The McClendons, who had given $5.5 million for the construction of a new dorm, found character-like statues described as resembling stone bobblehead dolls, which were embarrassing, and they requested their removal. Known for their modesty, the couple felt that the exaggerated figures with oversized heads and tiny bodies were too prominent and didn't align with their preference for subtle recognition. No, I wouldn't think so. Explained Peter Vaughn, the spokesman for Duke's development office. They were grateful. They just didn't approve of the way we showed our appreciation. So I don't know what the moral of that story is for you. What it was for me is, let's communicate with the donors and figure out what they want before we execute it. There's probably nothing wrong with the gargoyles, but I don't know if I want my giant head on a little tiny body above a doorway somewhere. By the way, it costs them some money to do that, so it's better to check first. Here's another one, responsibility. Responsibility is huge in this sector. Are we being truly responsible? And I've got a number of stories about this. So I'm going to read you a couple titles again, and you vote, and I'll try to figure out where we are. No Boundaries. Can you help me with my book? Just the Facts Man. And how much do you guys make? Okay, so I'll read those again. You vote. It's no boundaries. Can you help me with my book? Just the facts with an X, ma'am. And how much do you guys make? Okay, how much do you guys make? It looks like it's winning. So I'm going to read that one. Okay. This is an older one. I was researching a woman who was an attorney at Sears. This is when Sears was a big deal. So for those of you who don't know what Sears was, it was a big company for a long time. Anyway, I was researching a woman who was an attorney at Sears, and I was trying to estimate her income. I checked salary surveys, but they only had top corporate attorneys, while Sears had about 30 on staff. So I posted a message on their listserv, Prospect L, asking if anyone knew the salary ranges for corporate attorneys at big companies like Sears. I was stunned when I got the call the next day from the top corporate attorney at Sears, asking why I wanted to know the salaries of their attorneys. The lesson learned, I will never use the name of companies on a listserv, or in other words, in a public forum. You never know who's monitoring or searching for their name. And by the way, that's not to say that we hide what we're doing. We should always be, I believe, very clear in what our roles are and why they're so important, and how much we love what we do, and we also respect our donors and our institutions. But certain things that we do probably would not be well understood by people outside of it. So we need to do them in a way that makes sense and doesn't set people on edge or make them fearful. And a good example of this today, of course, is with not Prospect L or the AFP list or something like that so much, but it would definitely be potentially with some of the AI tools. So ChatGPT, if you go in there and you start looking up information on your people, that's going into an open system. And it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to redistribute it, but the system learns by what you and others teach it. And so that information now is a part of its body of knowledge. And in theory, that information could be redistributed to others. If you ask ChatGPT if it's doing that, it will say no, it's not. But it is an open system, and that is how it is designed for generative AI. So we should always be aware of the potential risk to our information and our donors by doing this kind of activity. And let me see, how much do you guys make? That's a quick one. I was, oh no, I'm sorry, that was the one I just did. So I'm going to move on. There are great examples also of that from AFP, including on sexual harassment. And we could spend a whole hour on that, and I'm not going to do that. It's so important that I would say that is an element both for our staff and for our donors and for our boards that we really have to think carefully about, discuss openly, have a policy that we can follow and apply it like the rule of law, because we have to protect our staffs, we have to protect our donors, we have to protect the people we serve, and we have to protect our board, and we all have to protect one another. So when it comes to sexual harassment, we can't just have learned from Me Too and then forget about it. It can't be like the William Aramoni. We got to keep applying it. Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to wrap up in a second, but I'm going to hit just maybe one more category. And that is, let me see, conflict of interest. So I'll read some titles, you tell me quick. Take My Clients, Please, Sharing the Wealth. We're all part of the same institution, aren't we? Which one do you like? So it's Take My Clients, Please, Sharing the Wealth. We're all part of the same institution. Okay. I work for an arts organization on a university campus, and we in the university share many of the same board members. One board member who does a lot of fundraising for us took the profiles I prepared on her prospects and gave them to the university administrators, who promptly called her prospects to verify the information and told where they got the info. Needless to say, we had what they described as a come to Jesus meeting with our board solicitors. Never assume that they know that profiles are confidential, despite a huge reminder at the top of a profile, much less the fact that we need to be very quiet in our community, that we even collect what she describes as personal information. I still shiver when I think about this. And then maybe just to round this up, because I know we're almost at the hour, I want to share two quick stories, one of which is very scary, and one of which is a little bit more humorous, because I think they make the point that we do need to be careful. But we can also uh, just keep everything in balance in our minds, that we don't need to be completely frightened and paralyzed. In fact, sometimes that paralysis leads to either not establishing these policies or not following them. So the first one is the terrible one, and it's perfect for Halloween. It's quite old because I don't think anybody would do this anymore, but there will be new versions of this on the horizon. And so it's really important that we learn from it. It's called the stalker. It was the start of term and things were swamped with people registering for classes. A young man came to the window, inquiring about a student for whom he had a social security number, saying he needed to deliver an urgent family message. My colleague made the rush decision that knowing the SS number was sufficient for confirmation of relationship. She confirmed the student was enrolled, but had changed her name, and handed him the easiest printout she could make, which was a form that included not only the student's class schedule and new name, but also her home phone number and address. The young man turned out to be an abusive former boyfriend who had been trying to find her for 6 months. She had changed schools, changed her name, made everything ex-directory. But because this colleague was in a rush, the student was murdered. Now, again, I think we're very careful with our data these days. But there will be holes in that process, just like I mentioned with Epstein at the start. And so it's very important, I guess, again, to revisit our policies. Now, this one's a little bit silly, but I think it's a good place to end, just to show that we can be mindful that this is fun stuff we do. We just still need to do it in a way that's ethical, and sometimes we can't control even when we try. And this is about a fundraising officer and a donor. They said, I'm not sure if this is horror or the opposite. A former colleague was working for a charity in Massachusetts and had an appointment with the campaign chair for a one-on-one meeting for planning. She told him she might be outside. Bob arrived, he knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He went around back, as he was previously directed, and found her sitting on a chase lounge by the pool. He sat down in a chair beside her, as she indicated, and they began their chat. Did I mention, by the way, that she was completely stark naked? The campaign chair was, to his mind, very attractive. Bob worked hard to keep his eyes fixed on her eyes the whole time during the entire conversation. We run into a lot of crazy things in this sector. Some of them are bad, some of them are just ridiculous. But I do think that we can do better about making sure that at least everybody understands not only what we're up against, but what we can do to make sure that job is done better. I hope some of these stories are kind of fun for you. I didn't see any of your stories here, but I hope you'll share some of those in the future as we continue down this path of making sure that there's a little less scary in our stories in the world of fundraising and philanthropy. Thanks very much, everybody, for being here. I'm going to join you next week from, of course, the AHP conference live from San Diego. And then the week after that, we will be at the conference for AASP, and that's in New Orleans. So I hope if you're in either of those cities or going to one of those conferences, you come up and say hello, maybe share the stories you weren't willing to share here, or just be a part of the conversation as we gravitate towards the new year. Until then, thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.